classe mangiare, o proletari alla riscossa, mangiare rossa trionferà. Bandiera rossa deve trionfare, bandiera rossa deve trionfare, bandiera rossa deve trionfare, e viva il comunismo e la libertà, avanti il popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, bandiera rossa.
Cheryl, you're still on mute. We can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Is that better? Yes?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I'm only going to talk about specifically the United States, but I think that what I'm going to say also applies to the UK, even though my historical knowledge of that is less than the US. But I mean, capitalism and its expansion in the United States was founded on the control and destruction of nature, the control and destruction of people of color, Black people, Chinese, Latinos, etc. That's what it was fundamentally based on, and also the control of women. All of those groups. So the land was wild, the animals were wild, women had babies, so they were wild and had to be controlled, and non-white people had to be controlled and destroyed because they were all obstacles to the control of nature by rich people. So these are the fundamental, the control of nature and the destruction of nature were built into the destruction of the land and the expansion of capitalism in the United States. And it's a type of consciousness associated with ownership that's really embedded in the culture. And I know the same things are true, I mean, in the UK, Ireland, etc. So those things are still fundamentally part of sort of the unconscious thinking that, you know, we've controlled nature, we've beaten it down, and we need to control it. And I think one of the things that's causing anxiety amongst people around the world today, and driving, you know, this attraction towards the conspiracy theories is that we are losing control over nature. We've had it in a box all these years, and it's out of the box. What the hell? What are we going to do? So I just think that's an important piece of this from sort of a psychological class point of view. And I mean, so I think that it's going to be, while it's true that this crisis is absolutely creating an opening in people's thinking. And I think that, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be easy to make this leap to saying, yes, we need control, and we do. What we need is control over the land, and we need control over the production, and we need control over our working lives. We need control of the society. I mean, I like the things that, I mean, when John mentioned the, you know, the demands, which I really like, linking up urban working class youth and small farmers, agricultural workers and small farmers around the world in the context of a working class party. Those are so critical because, of course, the people that are suffering the most from this crisis are agricultural workers, but all the marginalized people, you know, non-white people. I mean, this disease is clearly becoming, I mean, it's just, I mean, the class divide, it's ravaging the people who are at the bottom. And that's even becoming clear in sort of the biases. It's just really clear the way that people are behaving, that, well, I can't get it. I mean, it's not being stated, but I see it around me and I hear people talking about it, that, oh, I can't get it. I'm a middle-class white person. I don't live in an urban environment where people are having to live close together because they're poor and they're having to go to work every day. I'm a privileged person. This divide is large. So anyhow, so, but I think that people still receive some comfort, and I just generally from the idea or the notion, the false notion that we can control nature. And I mean, even though, so, okay, I'm jumping around a bit here. I think this addresses a primal fear that many people have about nature. So, I mean, that primal fear has been tapped into by climate change and the changes in the weather, flooding, fires, drought, and yet in response to that, people still say nature is completely out of control, and now we have this other thing that's happened that's even just as scary and horrifying. So I just think it's really important to remember that history, and to, I mean, I think Trish's points about who owns the land, who decides what we eat, who decides how food is produced, and who does the work on the land. These are really key. And I mean, I think that this is a really critical discussion, because I mean, it's helping me develop, like, what would I say if tomorrow I had the opportunity to speak at a socially distanced demonstration supporting healthcare workers or any workers for that matter. How would I inject this? What would I say so that it didn't just sound like, oh, and by the way, we've got to take back, you know, we have to stop destroying, you know, wild lands, and we have, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to, as John said, it's not going to be seamless, like, oh, okay, we blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot to think about and develop here. It's not that simple. So that's it.
Thanks, Cheryl. Next contributor is Mike Higgins. Yeah. Hello, Mike. If you can unmute yourself. It looks like Mike's on a mobile, so he's having more trouble. So you switch the video off, Mike, and you need to switch that back on, or you can leave, switch the microphone off. That's it, that's it. You should be able to speak now.
Right, sorry about that. You took me completely by surprise. I don't know why, because I did put my hand up a while ago, but I was so absorbed by the contributions that I wasn't ready to be called in, Dave. So my apologies for that, everybody.
That's all right.
Yeah, so I'm going to keep my contributions reasonably brief. I just wanted to kind of stress the need to ensure that we maintain an understanding that whilst at the moment we're talking about the huge impacts of the virus and the zoonotic viruses as a group, because as has already been said, the fact that we've got this one is an indicator that we will get more, but also the real flourishing of viruses. We've had mention of Ebola and the deadly character of that already, I think, during the introduction from the comrade who spoke first. But also, you know, we've got the potential for others after this, and the conditions, the objective conditions, whether it be the marketplace or the lab or anywhere else, that have led to that, to the creation and the spreading of the virus. But what I want to focus on a little bit, without really talking about UK perspectives, I think all of this poses lots of opportunities as well as challenges for us comrades within the UK, not least the national question, for example, but to focus more on international issues, looking at really the historic economic crisis, first of all, that this poses for capitalism. Because whether it's a crash of the technology now upon which we are all so dependent, like Zoom, but other technology too, and as years go by, capitalism is more and more and more dependent upon that technology, which, whilst it exists, is fine. Of course, it perpetuates economic growth for capitalism, but equally enables workers to talk to one another. On the other hand, when it is brought down, be that through some kind of state intervention or some other cause, it will be a disaster for capitalism, because previously all the infrastructures that existed that supported the continuation of economic activity are becoming more and more dependent upon the technology, and they will collapse if the technology goes. Likewise, we've had all the environmental, and I won't really go on about that because comments have really explained that, already quite extensively given the time we have available, but the environmental impact. But what I wanted to talk about was the globalization issue, because whether we are talking about any one of those three factors, whether we're talking about the environment, whether we're talking about the danger of viruses such as the current COVID-19, which interacts, of course, interplays with the environments, but also, or whether we're talking about the technological aspects, in the end, what they are all magnified by is the increased dependence of capitalism on globalization. Because on the one hand, we've got the nation state and the competition, which is now all too evident, brought into stark relief really by the COVID-19 crisis. Every day there's an item on, certainly on the UK news anyway, about how the state is trying to resist international pressures. We've got this ludicrous, bizarre proposal coming from the UK government now that on June the 8th, I'm not quite sure why they didn't leave it a bit longer, really. June the 8th seems quite soon. I'm joking. June the 8th to have a 14-day moratorium on anybody coming from anywhere, well, unless they're a trader or from France or from Ireland, or that was the other exceptions as well, what they're calling air bridges. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. But they've got this nonsense of all this, really the imposition of nationalism on that hand. And then, of course, you've got France this lunchtime who've said, well, if you're going to do it, we're going to do it too. We'll have a 14-day moratorium on people, and once they've come over, then they'll have to go into quarantine. Apart from that being completely unenforceable, we're getting every day messages from not just the White House, but from our own government and from governments internationally of a increasingly xenophobic character against the backdrop of what is a pandemic disease that is spreading exponentially, to use a scientific as well as a very populist term at the moment, spreading exponentially thanks to the growth of international capitalism. So not only did the marketplaces of China perhaps create the ground within which this virus was created and bred and allowed to take root, but also we have the capitalism within its own systems, creating the seeds of its own destruction. The final point, though, I wanted to touch on was about the economy, because I think whatever the cause of the international capitalist crisis, or causes of the international capitalist crisis, we will see that things like this disease in particular, and whatever succeeds it, will perpetuate or will accelerate the collapse of international capitalism. If you look in the UK, just to give an example from the domestic context here, we look at the creation of what they've called the furlough scheme, or the job retention scheme, which at the current reading means that a quarter of the workforce now are entirely dependent, or almost entirely dependent, on central government funding to maintain any kind of income. Now, we need to have no illusions that had we not got a strong, powerful, even now well-organised, conscious labour movement, I'm not really talking about the leaders so much as the rank and file, but if we hadn't got that, we wouldn't have things like the furlough scheme, and we wouldn't have resistance demanding PPE and all the rest of it. All of that is evidence of organised labour, actually, and of conscious labour. And when they try to withdraw that, when they try to withdraw all of the support that they've had to throw in, really, due to pressure from the organised working class, I think we will see quite quickly now an overturning of support, certainly in the UK for the Tory government, but more widely actually with the forthcoming elections in the US. And I'd be interested in comrades taking on that, because of course, unfortunately, we have no Bernie Sanders, which whilst he wouldn't have transformed society, would have helped a great deal. So we have nothing to drive forward the immediate left that's apparent from an international perspective at a US-wide level, although doubtless there are things going on locally and in communities that I'm not really aware of. But nonetheless, I suspect that what we are going to see as a direct consequence of both this pandemic, which isn't going to die out tomorrow or even by the end of this year, but also as a consequence of other things going on around it, things I touched on at the beginning of my contribution, what we're going to see is a raising of consciousness around all the issues that have been talked about today, but also this increasing unmatched competition between the nation state on the one hand, pressures from the nation state, evidenced through things like COVID-19 and the reaction to that, but also all the other things I've mentioned as well, and others I haven't had a chance to talk about. So we have the increasing pressure from the nation state and the demands for all of that we're tied up, for example, with Brexit in the UK, but lots of other things too, alongside the pressures for international globalization and all of the things that brings with it, including COVID-19. So I do think that the comments are right. This isn't a straightforward question. We do need to be ready, particularly with the scientific arguments, actually, particularly with the anti-conspiracy argument, particularly with the robust, clinical, clear scientific analysis, actually, and to all become epidemiologists, not armchair epidemiologists, but Marxist epidemiologists would be no bad thing, I would say. But also this provides us with a real opportunity, actually, to raise consciousness because of the experiences that it is forcing on workers already, and that it is going to force on workers over the next 6, 12 to 18 months. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Mike. Right, I'm noting the time. It's getting on for 2.5 hours, but we've only lost a few people. I've got 4 more people listed as wanting to speak. They are Tough Love, Roger, David, Hempson, and Felicity. So I'm going to try and keep it to those 4 people, unless someone on the chat makes a good call as to why they should be coming into the discussion as well. So Tough Love, if that's your real name. I suspect not.
It's Tough Love. He's gone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So my actual name is Earl. Tough Love is just an email address. First, I want to thank John for his efforts to bring us together, and I'm sure other people contributed. I want to just try and speak to the thing that caught my attention. How do we relate to the actual struggles that are going on now? Because it's clearly true, and everybody who speaks in different ways shows how it's related to the question of the land, it's related to the question of global relations with nature, and so on and so forth. But the actual struggles going on here in the States with the 200 wildcats, both in union and non-union locations, are all about people defending their health, defending their lives, defending their families' lives, and coming together collectively to put pressure on management for the corporations. So that's true in the hospitals, that's true in the auto factories, that's true in the farm workers, that's true in many, many places. And it seems to me that, at least here in the States, it gets right to the question of, why are we working? What do the employers have if they don't care whether we live or die? What does that tell us about who we are and what we have to do? So it seems to me that that's really where Marcus and Julia especially were talking about, how do we relate to that? For example, in the States, people are labeled as essential workers or non-essential workers. But nobody, no bankers, no lawyers, no corporate executives were listed as essential. So that's another point of contact with people whose lives are on the line, and yet the people who are actually pulling the strings and running the show are actually not essential. The economy works fine without them. Thank you very much. So my approach, and I live in a small city, but there are 30,000 part-time workers who work through employment agencies who are working in factories in this area, and there are people getting sick and dying. So it seems to me that that's really the issue that's posed before people, and that should be the entry point that we work on to relate to, because it raises all these questions about work, whose work, who hires, for what purpose. And the obvious, glaring, horrible reality is many of them operate and they have no concern whatsoever whether we live or die. So it seems to me that that's really where we should enter, and that's our connection with hospital nurses or grocery store clerks. And that's really all I wanted to contribute.
Thanks, Earl. Very succinctly put. Roger, you're next.
Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. My connection is a bit unstable, so I may fade away. I'll keep it short anyway. I mean, I just wanted to say that, I mean, I think this has been a very, very interesting discussion. And I think John has really given an excellent lead off, written some really brilliant material on this, and congratulations to him on that. I think we have to say also that this is not an entirely new issue, of course. It's reached, what has changed is it's reached an existential crisis. Now the environmental problem is affecting our lives in the most direct and immediate way, day by day, and on a whole global scale. I mean, it's an absolutely devastating new crisis which has developed. But in the past, I mean, I think it's true that socialists and activists were always aware of the environment, but they seem to be long-term dangers, and they were obscured by what seemed. Now it is an immediate issue. It's reached, as I say, an existential crisis. Contribution of 20th and 21st century capitalism to this phenomenon is this utter vandalism of whatever is left of the wild habitat, the destruction of the wild habitat. For instance, the Amazon rainforest, but there's also many other examples. And of course, the complete, I wouldn't say factory farming, let's say industrialization of farming that exists now. Vast areas of natural habitats are being slashed and demolished, and the deadly viruses and bacteria are being transmitted from wildlife to factory humans, zoonotic diseases. I think we also should bear in mind, because there is a myth about this, that the 21st century destruction of the wild habitat is not new. Never mind, it's not new under capitalism. It's not new even under the ancient civilizations of the past. Engels specifically cites examples of Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, and ancient slave societies, where they plundered and laid waste to their environments, and they reduced fertile lands to deserts. So this is really only a new manifestation of a law that was already recognized and brilliantly explained by Marx and Engels. It's a myth put about by, at least by some factions of the environmentalists, that Marxism took no account of environmental issues. That's simply untrue. They explained them absolutely brilliantly. They were the first, I think, to explain them and to put them into a context. I'd like to just repeat, I think, gave part of this quote, but I think it's worth always a memory to bear it in mind, when he says that we by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, like someone standing outside nature, but that we, with flesh, blood and brain, belong to nature and exist in its midst. Let's not flatter ourselves overmuch on account of our human conquest over nature, for each such conquest takes its revenge on us. I'd like to say on that, I think that Trish's comments were particularly illuminating. I must apologize to Trish in public now, because she is a neighbor of mine, and she did me the enormous favor. I didn't realize quite what a sacrifice she was making, that when I needed some shopping the other day, she actually bought me some chicken, which in view of her comments, I didn't realize quite what a traumatic experience that must have been for her. But I do think that we have to remember this question of meat eating, if you like, of carnivorism, it is related not only to the pandemic, but it's also related directly and immediately to the question of climate change. Somebody mentioned about methane and so on, but it's actually, unless we switch away from the production of livestock, whether by synthetic or artificial meats or something, which I think I would compromise on that rather than I would find it difficult to transfer to a 100% vegetarian or vegan diet. But anyway, it is an immediate issue now that that we have to switch. You know, one of the first tasks of the socialist revolution will be switching away from, never mind from factory farming, but from livestock production altogether. So really, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. David Hempson.
Yeah, hi, look, again, thanks to John for forcing us in a way to re-examine our ideas, to re-examine our documents, to re-examine some of our positions. And I just want to mention, you know, that the issues have been particularly about the fertility of the soil and the question of agriculture were raised by Roger's brother, I think, made the contribution in previous WIN documents. I was actually searching for it because it went to 2 or 3 pages. I think it was a document which came out in the in 2008 or so forth. But anyway, to say that, you know, the issues have been raised, but then they tend to slip again. And now we need to refocus and to understand. And so we had to look with a broad lens. The specifics on us are quite horrendous. Someone mentioned here the question of socialism or barbarism. And unfortunately, we're already in a barbaric state. I can't, let me just give you some examples. Friends of mine have passed on the news that 3 women in Zimbabwe were raped, were tortured, were forced to dance. Their feet were then slapped to pieces because they dared to protest against the Mnangagwa regime there. Corrupt. Of course, it would say it's not capitalist. Of course, it's the National Liberation Movement in action, but it's forcing. There's no water for the people in the 2 largest cities. People are reduced to going to boreholes, private boreholes. And sharing water. There are queues which go on for kilometers. This is not our headlines, but that's what's actually going on. Every regime, every government, every capitalist regime is elevating itself above society, either playing games with us, as we find in the States here, with jokes and stupidity, or in other countries, as in South Africa, now forcing all kinds of inane regulations, as long as they are in control, as long as they are in power. That is the key question. The question of COVID faces capitalist regimes with the question of retaining power and rolling back, you know, the demands of the working people. There are some marvelous points which I forget again. I apologize who had raised it. I think maybe it was Mike, but about you know, the whole process of colonization.
Very poor Wi-Fi or whatever. Yeah.
Process of colonization, and to be able to clear the land for agriculture. Can you imagine the effect, you know, on nature and on society? Now, when we look at our current situation, and the crisis is a multiple crisis, because it's a crisis of capitalism, it's a crisis of the management of agriculture, it's a crisis of the climate change, where we've had these roaring fires ripping through California and through Australia and even into Serbia and to the Arctic zone. You know, we are in a terrible mess. It's a cascading set of crises, and we have to try and bring them into a relationship, a kind of have the deep theoretical understanding that's necessary to be able to give leadership at the time, and not just to jump from one issue to the other as our inclination, but through developing a transitional program to touch on all of these issues, not to finish on each of them because that requires further study, but to pull together a transitional program so that you know, the working class can come to power and start dealing with this frightful mess, you know, which we're living in. The immediate results, though, are horrendous. I just see in an email just come to mind that Mark Zuckerberg is now $30 billion richer over the last 4 weeks. Every person I know is about that much, that proportion of their wealth or their income has been reduced. They've lost at least, at a minimum, 30%. And others have lost 70% of the income at the moment. And that is what's going on. It's a capitalist crisis. It's brought about through the lack of ability to be able to work together cooperatively with nature and to draw on resources and to replenish resources. The regenerative capital, you know, agriculture has been set out. And now we see that we are in a situation of deepest crisis. There's a wildcat strike at the moment, as I think maybe Mike mentioned or somebody else. You know, this is because to defend Earl, you know, mentioned people struggling to defend their health. But now I heard on yesterday's on a roundup on NPR that every worker now has accepted wage cuts. My daughter has now accepted a wage cut and working on it. She has a reasonably good job because she's working now. By the way, teachers online have gone up from 8 hours work a day to 12 hours work a day. That's what my daughter's working. So in other words, capital is squeezing the working class, even if you're at home, to be able to work inordinate hours. And everybody is accepting something of a wage cut, at least here in the States, you know, right at the moment. And so there's a crisis actually of capitalism of insufficient demand. Of course, Keynesians would say, well, they've got an answer, but they don't really, because in the end it actually comes to a crisis of overall of capitalism. So the point I'd conclude in is we need to pull together, that's part of our task, and when to be able to pull together the issues, pull together the demands that we should be raising through the Wildcat Strikes Action, to be able to generalize that, and to be able to put forward transitional demands of the immediate and the broader relationship, so that we can build a political power which can come to power and actually start the remedial process. And boy, it's a task. Thanks.
Thanks, David. I've been corrected on my timekeeping. It wasn't 2.5 hours. It was only 1.5 hours. So we haven't even done 2 hours yet. And believe me, it's not that I thought the meeting was going on too long. So there is time for any other person to come in if they wish. And I have 2 more speakers at the moment, Felicity, and then Trish wants to come back in again. So Felicity, please.
I want to talk about the beginnings, the build of conspiracy theorists and the link between rejecting the science of the current crisis, either the crisis around the virus or the crisis around the climate, and basic rejection by the far right, and building the far right building on this anti-science message. And I think that it doesn't answer any of the major points that David just raised just then. And it really only raises one small part of what John Ryman was talking about. But it's the idea that we as socialists should agitate for science. We should be agitating and making it clear that socialism and science, you know, go hand in hand. That, you know, that we can critique science, as John mentioned that the author did, in saying that science is distorted by capitalism, by the amount of money that goes into certain sections of science for research and that doesn't go into others. I mean, you know, one of my things that really bugs me is that most science around medicine is not designed for women. It's designed for men. Women's bodies are not considered in those discussions. But women need science. I mean, I was thinking of one example is that the science around the fact that we need, I've forgotten the name of the particular thing now, that there's a particular food that women need to eat when they're pregnant to try and avoid spina bifida pregnancies. that came in my lifetime. I've seen that science develop. It's now well respected. Without it, many more children would be disabled. Climate campaigners need science. The people who are trying to grow their own food as their contribution to helping the climate crisis, they urgently need science. They need to know how to grow food and how to avoid the pests that might come and damage their food. Just getting decent water supply into countries requires science, and that workers have fought. For instance, the one that I knew a bit about was the campaign against working with asbestos. That campaign required science to actually develop it. So I'm kind of arguing that we should have our, slogans and agitation around the idea that the workers' movement, that socialism, that the future needs science. Any of you who are on Facebook a fair amount must know that you're constantly trying to answer the nonsense of the conspiracy theorists and the 5G people and the anti-vaxxers and the people who are saying the virus doesn't exist and that they won't obey rules about it, and it's all a conspiracy. And just 2 examples. There was a bloke called John Snow in London who developed who researched really carefully and found out which taps in London, shared taps that people went to in the streets, were actually the source of a cholera epidemic. And that work he did by literally mapping the city, going through the city, seeing where people were most ill and working out, knowing it was a waterborne illness, knowing where he could find the he actually did was found it and turned it off, and that turned off the problem in that area. But there's also in Liverpool, in the history of the workers' movement in Liverpool, there's a woman called Kitty Wilkinson, and again cholera was a major crisis for people in the early industrial cities, and there was a major cholera epidemic. She happened to be slightly better off than the rest of her neighbours. She had a basement with a boiler in it, and she worked out that if she took her neighbours, she invited her neighbours to come in and boil their washing so that the sheets were properly disinfected after, because cholera is rather foul in what it leaves on your sheets. And in her area, where people were boil washing their clothes, which most people couldn't possibly do in their ordinary houses, the disease was controlled. And from that came a major campaign for wash houses. And the wash houses were developed across the city where working class women could take their washing, do their washing in really hygienic circumstances, and they had access to hygiene in that way. So there's history we can use in terms of campaigning for working people to aspire to science and advocate science, and there's lots of local normal agitational issues that people can use from their workplace. So I mean, my contribution today is based around the fact that let's answer the conspiracy theorists by a campaign for science.
Thanks, Felicity. Trish, if you want to unmute yourself.
That was great, Felicity. Fantastic. Yeah, I think the right wing tend to be anti-science because science, I mean, there's been loads of studies around education. The more educated you are, the more left you are. That's the reality, I think, of almost all studies that they've looked at. The fact is people don't want us to know, because once we know, we can get rid of them. So keeping us stupid is a vital tool of the ruling class, and they've always used this. And I will go back, and I do want to go back to this ownership thing, ownership of land. The fact is, the Wild West in America was won by the state, if you like, giving people land. They gave people land to go and from the people who already lived there, and that land was given to them to protect, and guns were given them to protect it. And that, if you like, is the model of capitalism that we see all out the world, in one way or another, maybe less crude or less hand-fisted, but it kind of grows from that. This idea that land belongs to people, and then what they do with that land is they decide what they grow on it, how they make it function. We as humans, we don't maintain land, we destroy land. We don't maintain it. As Roger said, from the beginning, we've been making deserts. Beavers look like they destroy the environment. In fact, they enhance it. We're only just learning this now. We're learning biodiversity is the only thing that maintains our planet. It is the only way that we can survive as a species. And the interesting thing is, I know that you're all gorgeous. We're all fabulous because we're left wing, so I love you already. And you don't have to prove anything to me because I already think you're gorgeous because you're here. The truth is, we're all getting on a bit. What we need is we need a young movement. And the young movement is, if we're looking at Greta, and we're looking at Greta and how she's attacked by the right wing is remarkable. We're looking at people like Greta, who's environmentally inspired. And we're looking at, I would almost guarantee Greta will be a vegan. One of the important things I've learned, I've only been a vegan 2 years, vegetarian over 35. But what I learned from vegans very quickly is they know stuff, they understand the science of food, they research, they're passionate, they don't give a shit if you laugh at them. They will go in the middle of a room and be hated for it, laughed at by their family, by their friends. And this is happening to me. People really hate vegans, believe me. Vegetarians, they think you're a bit interesting. Vegan, they fucking hate your gut straight away. It's because it really usurps what people expect to be true. And the fact is, vegans, therefore, are people we need. We need them because they're young, they're angry, they know stuff, they're clever. They've learned it, they continue to learn it, and they challenge the basics of what we think we know, like milk is good for children. That is the basics of what we've been told. Breast milk is great for children, by the way. The pus that comes from cows really isn't. And it took me a lifetime to learn that. But the fact is, you know, I learned that from my grown-up child. You know, the truth is, we need to change how we live fundamentally. So the word farming needs to be challenged. We need to be talking about rewilding. We need to be talking about taking the land back. We need to take it from the people who own it. And the people who own it need to stop being able to tell us how to live. They tell us what to eat, what to buy. They tell us everything. And we can start by not owning the land and not owning the animals that live on it, but respecting that we have to share the space with them. And the only way we can do that is to reduce. Stop thinking about GDP as the only way forward. Capitalism has to be smashed. There's no other way. And vegans don't realise yet that but if we can enhance the 600,000 vegans in the UK from 140,000 4 years ago, that's a big movement. That's a big movement of young, passionate people. And they're not socialists as a rule. The truth is, the only way they'll get their end goal is to smash capitalism as well. We need to inform them about that, and then we need to use their energy. That's my point.
Good point.
Passionate as ever, Trish. Rolf, you had your hand up.
Yes, of course, I agree that the most important is to prevent these diseases, but nobody has mentioned the possibility of getting a cure of this I remember, and I can't remember what it's called now. But anyway, if we had socialism, we of course would make it possible for scientists to develop a cure, to develop a drug which could cure this disease. And of course, lots of medical firms, the medical industry is now trying to produce a drug. And I think they have found one. It's not a cure, but it is reducing the seriousness of the disease. But of course, they will make a lot of profit from what they have developed. So instead of dealing their knowledge and helping people to get cured from coronavirus, they will focus on how much money they can earn. But I think we should put this item into the discussion also, because of course we should prevent the disease. We should do what we can, and I agree that I agree in what has been said about the capitalists use food and so on. Yes, that was my point, to get a cure.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, I think this would be a good point if John would like to come back or even sum up. But if anyone wants to, he may raise some new points that people want to come back in. So by all means, we don't necessarily close the meeting after John speaks. But John, would you like to come back now?
Yes, sure. First of all, I'd just like to call your attention to what I just posted on that chat there. If you're interested in further reading along the lines of what I've been talking about, those are two things there. Now, also just finally, in response to the last point about a cure, yes, of course, not only the issue of a cure, but also the issue of a vaccine. But I'd also like to point out that it's not 100% certain that either a cure or a vaccine is possible. I'm not saying it's not possible, but they don't know if it is possible, especially as far as the vaccine, because they don't know to what extent humans can develop antibodies to COVID-19, and if they do develop antibodies, how long those antibodies last. So my point in raising that is to say, yes, vaccines and cures and all of that are important and necessary, but as Wallace says, once the virus is out in the world, it's already too late. That the focus has to be on reversing the conditions which encourage and therefore make inevitable the development of these new viruses. Again, to emphasize, I'm not saying that we should not discuss these issues of a vaccine and a cure, but we can't let Fauci and the others, I don't know if everybody in Britain knows who Fauci is. He's the leading scientist here. Fauci, around this issue, Fauci and the others, that's all they talk about. And they do that as a means of actually covering up the underlying causes. And it's a form of eco-modernism, which is a whole other issue that really needs further discussion. Now, I want to say on the issue of I know a lot of socialists and very well-informed and thoughtful socialists who are not familiar with Rob Wallace and not familiar with the connection between this pandemic and factory farming and habitat destruction. And I think, again, that does speak to a somewhat pragmatic focus of a lot of Marxists and a lot of socialists on these issues. And one Facebook friend of mine said that he has to find the time to read Wallace. And I responded, no, don't find the time to read him, make the time to read him. Because there's no other way of understanding what's happening here without reading his material. Now, I did not mean to imply that Roger raised the issue that Marx and Marxists have always dealt with the issue of environmentalism. And he read one of my favorite quotes from Engels on that, which I believe I also quoted from. And that's true, but I do think that it has not sufficiently sunk in amongst most Marxists, the different nature of this crisis from all other previous crises that humanity has faced under capitalism. And to repeat what I said in the beginning, that all other previous crises arose out of the contradictions within capitalism itself, through the laws of motion of capitalism itself. This is a crisis between capitalism and the laws of nature. And I emphasize the theoretical questions, the question of science and being finding a way to bring those issues into the workers' movement. Not because I mean to belittle the importance of getting involved in the workers' movement, of trying to find a way to help it move forward and so on. If we don't do that, then we're nothing but at very best keyboard warriors. So I'm not saying that we should not be doing that or minimizing the importance of that, but I do think that it's true that that socialists and socialism in general has tended to do that without doing the other part. And that's why I gave such an emphasis to that other part. And I think that what Felicity said really bears repeating, that science and socialism go hand in hand. And what she said about finding a way to make that an agitational issue. I'm going to try something that I haven't done before, and that is I want to, I was going to, Dave, I was going to try to do a screen share. But it says that's been disabled. But
keep talking. I'll go to the other machine to see if I can.
If it's a problem, I was just going to show a couple photos of some right-wing Trumpster thugs who had appeared at a rally of nurses, and they came there to try to intimidate those nurses. And what that speaks to is, yes, we see the movement of the working class. As I said, and as other people have referred to, okay, all right, so now we have it. I hope, let's see. Just a second, I'm gonna try to do this. I don't know if I will succeed. Just a second. Just a second, I'm trying to, let's see if I can do that. Never mind, it's too complicated for my pitiful, I can't, if you want to disable the screen sharing, Dave, I'm not able to get that going. Anyway, my point was that while we clearly see and emphasize the importance of this movement of the working class, we must not underestimate the danger of these right-wing movements. I don't know if any of you comrades have heard of this Judy Mikovits and this video that she's making called Plandemic. But when it came on YouTube, before it was deleted by YouTube, which was after just a few days, 8 million people had hit that video. And I know people, there's 3 different people that sent me the link to that video, and they were very impressed by it. All 3 of those people would consider themselves to be on the left and as being hard opponents of Trump. So as Felicity said, the only way we can combat that, and it is a real threat, the only way we can combat it is by raising the science, or at least we can't adequately combat it if we don't raise the science. On the issue of, and I think that one way that we can raise it, and well, I'll come back to that. On the issue of vegetarianism, as I said, if I had to kill everything I ate, I would be a vegan. But as a matter of principle, I think that we do also have to look at regenerative farming. That's a whole other issue that I haven't had a chance to get into, but if you note on the links that I posted, there's also one link to an article on regenerative farming. So on the on this issue of how to raise the issue of science in an agitational way. I think this is just something that I was just thinking about when listening to Felicity, is that, you know, one point about all these workers' rebellions is what is it a rebellion against? It's a rebellion against workers being treated as nothing more than little units of labor power there to be dominated and exploited. And in the same way, the same ones who are trying to dominate and exploit us, which is the capitalist class, bring the exact same attitude towards the natural world. And we cannot adequately fight against the domination and exploitation of us as workers without also fighting against that attempt to dominate and exploit the natural world itself. I think, just one last point on this issue of the unions. Here in the United States, the great majority of worker rebellions have happened in non-union workplaces. And in the union places where they have happened completely outside of the leadership, no less the control of the union leadership itself. And that speaks to the dire necessity of linking up these rebellions with a struggle to completely transform the unions and make them into the fighting organizations that so many workers sacrificed and died for in the first place.
Sono I confini, rosse bandiere, o proletari, alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà.